The morning of my engagement dinner, I stood in my childhood bedroom mirror adjusting the strap of my dress and thought, this is the happiest I've ever been. I should have known better than to trust that feeling. My fiancé. I'll call him my fiancé because even now, saying his name out loud feels like touching a bruise. Had proposed 3 months earlier at a small Italian place in the West Village. Nothing dramatic. He'd slipped a ring across the table between the breadbasket and the candles, and I'd cried into my pasta, and the couple next to us had clapped. It was perfect in the way that only simple things can be perfect. His name was Preston. Preston Aldridge. The kind of name that comes with a family crest and expectations. I'm not from that world. My dad worked 30 years as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company in Akron, Ohio. My mom taught 2nd grade until her knees gave out. We weren't poor. We were the kind of comfortable that required careful planning and never ever asking for things you couldn't afford. I went to Ohio State on a combination of scholarships, student loans, and summers spent waitressing at a lakeside resort. I got my MBA at 26. By 29, I was managing a commercial real estate portfolio for a mid-sized investment firm in Manhattan. I'd built something, not flashy, solid. Preston knew all of this. He'd always seemed proud of it, actually, the way he'd tell people at his work functions. She built her career completely on her own, with this warmth in his voice that made me feel seen. His family was another story. His mother, I'll call her my future mother-in-law, had made it clear from the very first Sunday brunch in their Westchester home that she found me acceptable, the way you find a piece of furniture acceptable. It fits the space. It doesn't clash. But it wasn't quite what she'd had in mind. I'd spent 2 years trying to earn something from that woman that she was never going to give me. The engagement dinner was her idea, 40 people at the private room of a restaurant in Midtown. Her friends, Preston's college friends, my parents who flew in from Ohio and looked slightly stunned the entire evening. My mother wore her nice blazer. My father shook everyone's hand with both of his, the way he always does when he's nervous and trying not to show it. I loved them so much for being there. I had no idea what was about to happen to all of us. We were between the salad and the entree when Preston's father, a man who had spoken maybe 60 words to me in 2 years, stood up and tapped his glass. I thought he was going to give a toast. He did not give a toast. He did not give a toast. He said in the calm, unhurried voice of a man who has spent 40 years in corporate law, that before the families could officially celebrate this union, there was a matter that needed to be addressed. He said this the way you might announce that the parking validation was available at the front desk. Completely ordinary tone. Like what he was about to say was just a minor administrative detail. He said that he and Preston's mother had consulted with their attorney, and they felt it was only responsible, his word, responsible, to ensure that a prenuptial agreement was in place before the wedding. I nodded slowly. I'd actually expected this. A prenup was reasonable. I had no problem with a prenup. Then he slid a folder across the table to me. We'd love for you to have a chance to look this over tonight, he said. I opened it. The room felt like it tilted slightly, the agreement, and I use that word loosely because an agreement implies 2 parties with roughly equal standing. Stated that in the event of divorce, I would be entitled to nothing acquired during the marriage. Not unusual on its own. But it also required me to waive any claim to Preston's existing assets, his inheritance, and, this is the part that made my vision go a little white at the edges, any business interests he might acquire in the next 30 years. And there was a clause, buried on page 4, that made me responsible for 50% of any debt Preston incurred during the marriage. I was supposed to get nothing, and be responsible for half of everything bad. His mother was watching me read. I could feel it. When I looked up, she gave me a small, practiced smile. We just want to make sure everyone is protected, she said. I looked at Preston. He was looking at his water glass. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment because it wasn't rage, not yet. It was something quieter and more clarifying. Like when you've been trying to see something in your peripheral vision and you finally just turn your head and look directly at it. I thought about the last 2 years. The dinners where his mother talked over me. The Christmas where she gave me a cookbook. While Preston's sister received a piece of jewelry. The way Preston had always said, she's just like that. She doesn't mean anything by it. And I had always let it go. I thought about 3 weeks earlier, when I had been sitting at my desk at 11 at night, reviewing lease agreements for a new acquisition, and I thought to myself, I am so good at this. I have built something real. And then I texted Preston a picture of my takeout container with the caption "Romantic dinner for one," and he'd sent back a heart emoji, and I'd felt happy. I set the folder down on the table. I said very quietly, "I'll need to have my attorney review this." His father's expression flickered, just briefly, with something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it, like he'd expected less resistance. "Of course," he said. "We do hope it won't take too long. The wedding is in 4 months." His mother added gently, as though the gentleness made it better, "We think it would be best if this was settled before we start making the larger deposits for the venue." And there it was. "Sign quickly, or we'll slow walk the wedding until you do." My mother, sitting 3 seats away from me, had gone very still. My father had set down his fork. They understood what was happening even if they couldn't hear the specifics. I excused myself to use the restroom. In the bathroom, I stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists. Something my grandmother taught me when I was little, that it calms you down faster than anything. I looked at myself in the mirror. My dress was green silk. My hair was up. I had spent 40 minutes getting ready that afternoon, and I had felt so happy standing in my childhood bedroom. I took out my phone. I want to explain something before I tell you what I did next, because otherwise it might seem calculated or cold-blooded, and it was neither. 6 weeks before this dinner, my firm had closed on a commercial property acquisition in Midtown Manhattan, a 12-story office building. The kind of deal that takes 18 months and more paperwork than I can describe. It was the largest transaction I'd ever led, and I had a 7% ownership stake in the investment vehicle. That stake was worth, at closing, approximately $2.3 million. I also owned, outright, a 2-bedroom condo in Hoboken that I bought 4 years ago and had been renting out, and I had a brokerage account that I'd been quietly building since I was 23. Index funds mostly, that had grown to just over $400,000. Preston knew I was doing well. He knew I had the condo. He knew I worked hard. What he did not know, what I had never had reason to lay out in a spreadsheet, was the full picture. What his family did not know was that the building they were trying to exclude me from benefiting from, the building where his father's law firm had been a tenant for 11 years, was partly mine. I didn't know this when we started dating. I'd found out 8 months into our relationship when I started doing due diligence on the acquisition and recognized the tenant list. I flagged it to my managing partner as a potential conflict of interest. We documented it appropriately, and I'd continued on the deal because there was no actual conflict. A tenant doesn't benefit or suffer from a change in building ownership, and the lease terms were already locked. But I knew. And I had a full documentation package on my phone. The closing documents, the equity schedule, the tenant summary, because I had been reviewing them that afternoon for an unrelated reason. I opened my files. I walked back out to that private dining room, and I did not sit down. I went to the head of the table, where the restaurant had set up a small AV system for a photo slideshow Preston's mother had planned for later in the evening. I asked the event coordinator if I could use the screen for a moment. She looked uncertain. I smiled at her. "Just a couple of slides," I said. "It'll be quick." I connected my phone. The room had gone quiet, 40 people watching me, unsure whether to keep pretending this was a normal dinner party or acknowledge that something was happening. I said, "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It means so much to Preston and me." I paused. I also want to take a moment to respond to the conversation we were just having, because I think everyone at this table deserves transparency. His mother's chin lifted very slightly. I pulled up the first document, the equity schedule from the closing. I didn't project it. I just held up my phone, clearly, toward Preston's parents. "I have a 7% equity stake in a commercial property acquisition that closed 6 weeks ago," I said. "The property is at," and I named the address. The color left Preston's father's face in a way that was almost interesting to watch, clinically. Because he knew that address, he signed a lease renewal there every 3 years. My stake in that investment is currently valued at approximately $2.3 million, I continued. I also own a condo in Hoboken outright, and I have a brokerage account that I'd be happy to discuss with any attorney. I set my phone down. I have absolutely no problem signing a prenuptial agreement, I said. I think they're smart and I think couples should talk about money. But I will be having my own attorney draft it. I will need 60 days minimum to review any document, and I will not be signing anything that was written exclusively to protect one side of this table. Nobody spoke. Also, I said, I'd like to point out that requiring someone to waive inheritance rights and assume 50% of their spouse's debt is not a prenup. That's a liability transfer. And I think everyone here who has a law degree knows the difference. Preston's father had a law degree. 3 of his college friends had law degrees. I had done my homework on the guest list. I picked up my clutch. I said to Preston, quietly and just for him, I love you. And I think you need to decide, tonight, whose voice matters most to you. Then I walked to my parents' end of the table, touched my mother's shoulder, and said, I'm going to step outside. Come find me when you're ready. My father stood up immediately, without a word, just stood up, immediately, without a word, and my mother folded her napkin, set it on her plate, and followed. Outside on the sidewalk, my father put his arm around me and said, You doing okay, sweetheart? I said, I think so. He nodded. He looked back at the restaurant window. He said, That was some good lawyering for someone who doesn't have a law degree. I laughed, and it came out shakier than I expected, and then I cried a little bit, standing on a midtown sidewalk in my green silk dress while a cab honked somewhere behind us. Preston came out 12 minutes later. I know it was 12 minutes because I was watching the time. He looked, and I want to be accurate here, because he's not a villain in my story, even if this is the part of the story where he behaved badly. He looked like someone who had just been told he had to choose between 2 things and hadn't known until right now that the choice was real. He said, Why didn't you tell me all of that? I said, You never asked. And it never came up because I didn't think it mattered between us. He said, It doesn't matter, I said. Then tell your parents that. He was quiet for a long time. He said, They're not going to change. And I said, I know. That was, in a strange way, the hardest moment. Not the document, not the dinner, not the AV cart. Just that sentence, and the way he said it like it was a fact about the weather, rather than a choice. We stood there for a while longer. Then I said, I think I'm going to get my parents home. Can we talk tomorrow? He said yes. We did talk the next day. And the day after that. For about 2 more weeks, we talked in the way that people talk when they're trying to hold something together that has already come apart at the seam. I gave back the ring on a Thursday evening in his apartment, not dramatically. We were eating takeout and watching something neither of us was actually watching, and I slid it off my finger and set it on the coffee table and said, I think we both know. He looked at the ring for a long time. Then he said, I'm sorry about my family. I said, I know you are. I meant it. Here's what I want people to understand, because I've had a lot of time to think about this. The prenup wasn't what broke us. The prenup was just the moment when I finally stopped being able to pretend that what I'd been seeing in the corners of my vision wasn't there. The mother-in-law who smiled over me. The father-in-law who had never once asked me a question about my work. The way Preston had, for 2 years, managed his family's discomfort by asking me, quietly, kindly, with love, to be smaller. I had been shrinking myself to fit a frame that was never going to accommodate me. After we ended things, I had lunch with my best friend. She'd been at the dinner. One of the 40 people watching me stand up there was my phone. She said, I have never been more terrified and proud of anyone in my entire life. She said it with her hand pressed to her chest, genuinely. I said, I was terrified too. She said, You didn't lick it. I said, I was running cold water over my wrists in the bathroom and praying I didn't pass out. She laughed so hard she had to put her fork down. My mother called me the next morning after the dinner and said, and this is the thing that stays with me. She said, I want you to know that your father and I have been married for 37 years, and not once have we ever asked each other to be less than we are. That's the whole thing. That's all of it. She's right, that's all of it. I still work at the firm. The Midtown building is doing well. Occupancy is strong, and we have 2 tenants who have expanded their footprints in the last quarter. Preston's father's law firm renewed their lease in January. I signed off on it. I am not a person who holds grudges. I am a person who does her job. I'm only telling you this because enough time has passed that it feels okay, quietly, cautiously, seeing someone new. He's a structural engineer who grew up in Pittsburgh. He thinks my condo spreadsheet is, quote, actually kind of impressive. He asked me on our third date what my 5-year plan was, and I told him in some detail, and he listened to the whole thing and then said, okay, how do I fit into that? I thought about Preston saying they're not going to change like it was settled fact. Then I thought about my mother saying we never asked each other to be less. I think that's the version of love worth waiting for. The one where your actual size is welcome. Where you don't have to fold yourself up to fit through the door. I'm 31 years old, I have a long time to get this right. But I think I finally know what I'm looking for. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that night. Not the drama of it, not the AV cart or the green silk dress or Preston's father's face going pale, but what was underneath all of it. What made it possible? The honest answer is that I spent years building something quiet, not for anyone else. Not to impress a future in-law or win an argument I didn't know was coming. I built it because I believe that your work should reflect the full weight of who you are, that you don't do the hard thing halfway. I stayed late on deals that nobody asked me to care about that much. I read the fine print when nobody was watching. And somewhere in all of that discipline, all those late nights and takeout containers and spreadsheets I reviewed twice, I became someone who could stand at the head of a table without her voice shaking. That's the part people don't see when they hear a story like mine. They see the moment, the phone, the screen, the quiet delivery of information that changed everything in the room. What they don't see is the 10 years before it. There's something I've come to believe pretty firmly. The way you treat the ordinary days determines who you are when the extraordinary ones arrive. I didn't walk into that restaurant prepared because I planned some elaborate revenge. I walked in prepared because that's simply how I'd learned to live. Careful. Thorough. Honest about what I had and what I'd built. Those aren't dramatic qualities. They don't make for a great dinner party story on their own. But they are the reason I was still standing at the end of that night, when other people in that room were not. And then there's the other side of it. The part that's harder to talk about because it requires me to be honest about what I chose to ignore for too long. I saw the signs with Preston's family. I saw them early. The condescension dressed as politeness. The way I was subtly, consistently made to feel like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome in a house she hadn't been invited to in the first place. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself love was bigger than that. It is. But love also requires that you tell the truth, including to yourself. The kindest thing I ever did for Preston, and for myself, was to stop pretending I hadn't noticed. There's no villain here, not really. His father acted in the interest of what he valued. His mother did the same. Even Preston, in his silence, was being honest about something he couldn't yet say out loud. What I learned is that the cruelest thing one person can do to another isn't a document or an ultimatum. It's asking someone to slowly disappear, to be quieter, smaller, easier, and calling it love. I wasn't willing to disappear. And the moment I stopped being willing, everything that needed to happen happened. I'm 31 now. I work hard. I'm careful with money and careful with people and getting better, slowly at knowing the difference between someone who wants to know me and someone who wants a version of me that's easier to manage. That distinction matters more than almost anything. What I keep coming back to, what I'd want anyone in a similar place to hear is this. The life you build when no one is watching is the life that protects you when everything goes sideways. Your integrity isn't just a moral quality, it's a practical one. It shows up for you. It stood up for me in a midtown restaurant on a Tuesday night in front of 40 people in a green silk dress. That's enough for me.